Hello, Ruth Dudley Edwards.
Hello, George.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great,
Well,
great.
good.
Thanks for agreeing to be interviewed. Anyway, so you're a writer, historian, journalist sometimes, and so what was your first book?
My first book was actually on an Atlas of Irish History. So it was a sort of general textbook in the early 1970s.
I see.
And but the first sort of substantial book was a biography of the chap who was the Patrick Pearse, who was the name of the Irish nationalist rising in 1916.
The Triumph of Failure, yeah. And was there anything controversial about that book?
Yes, there was a lot controversial about that book. It came as rather a surprise to me. I had written the book because nobody seemed to know anything about him. So the history books had very little detail on him, and yet we were told he was the noblest man in Irish history. There were no private papers. I had tried to do an MA degree on him, but there just wasn't the material when I was at university.
Because that's when you went to Girton College, Cambridge.
Yes.
And what were you doing at Girton?
I was doing, began a PhD on, I gave up on Pearse. I did my MA on something else, and I was doing something in 15th century history in Girton, and I realised it bored me.
15th century Ireland?
No, it was Anglo-Papal relations at the time. But anyway, that's by the way. I always had an interest in this guy, Patrick Pearse, and then a commercial publisher asked me to do a book on him.
Was this the first biography of him?
There were various biographies which were in no way objective. They were hagiographies, but based on very little, based on hearsay and people's testimonies and a lot of made-up stories. So I happened to come along to do that one at a stage when there was papers of his had emerged. So there was actually objective evidence.
What did you say about him that was contentious?
Yeah, quite a lot of things actually. I showed him to be a human being, which he wasn't supposed to be. He was supposed to be a saint.
Well, what were his shortcomings?
Complete lack of reality about other people. Absolute obsessive about self-sacrifice. Determined to die for Ireland, whatever it took, really. And he was a brilliant teacher. And he was involved in passing on to children a narrative of treachery and betrayal by the British and hatred. And I think he did an enormous amount of harm, and without him there would not have been the 1916 rebellion, and a lot of people would have been alive in the last 100 years in consequence.
And you're probably the first one to write about his homosexual tendencies.
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
Not in any judgmental way. I think he was drawn towards homosexuality, and I think he was so innocent he didn't even know what his problem was. He was terrified of women, absolutely terrified of them.
I was going to say, there's no evidence he actually acted on these urges, is there?
No.
Likewise, it seems that he was sexually attracted to minors, isn't that right?
Yes, he was.
But again, I don't think there's any evidence he did anything wrong.
No,
yeah.
He sometimes kissed them. He'd be in trouble these days, but in innocent days he wouldn't be.
Right. Goodness, I'm just trying to think of your other controversial writings. Well, more recently, Seven, about the 7 signatories of the Proclamation of the Irish Republic. So do you have any admiration for any of these men?
Yes. They were a very likeable bunch in many ways, some of them quite remarkable. Tom Clark, who was the most important person in 1916, but stayed in the background. Without him, there wouldn't have been a revolution. He was in jail for several years under a terribly harsh regime. And he was a remarkable man, very self-discipline and selflessness. Also did terrible harm, really through hatred.
No.
But he was, in many ways, an admirable man. I may not approve of what they did. It happens. Sean McDermott, who was Tom Clark's leg man, really, utterly charming. Some of the others, you really enjoy an evening out with them.
Tom Clark was born in England, but was he half English or not? Was he fully Irish? I don't remember.
Oh, his father was in the British Army, so he moved about. He spent some of his childhood in South Africa.
Because of the 7...
He was Irish.
Okay, so Pearse was half English, Clark was English born, and of the 7, were any of those not fully Irish?
I'm trying to remember. I used to have this tip on my tongue not long after I wrote it. Who else? Well, it wasn't so much that. It was that there was a lot of involvement with the army, for instance. Eamon Kent, his father was a policeman.
Yes.
MacDermot's brother was a policeman. Who am I forgetting about? James Connolly was born in Scotland.
Right.
So the most important names from them, one half English and the other born in Scotland.
Yes, because I
And
like.
he hid that.
Uh-huh. I like to point out to people that Patrick Pearse was English. People are all saying he's Irish, which he was, but anyone who's half English can also be called English, so I'm trying to correct this overemphasis in his Irishness by saying that. And
He loved his father dearly, and his father had a Birmingham accent, and Pearse had a slight Birmingham accent, because a lot of his father's relatives used to come to the house, and he was sneered at in school about that.
So maybe over protestation. I'm as Irish as anyone else, I'm going to be therefore more Anglophobic.
That's a very big thing. It
Right.
happens all the time. It's a recurring motif in Irish history.
I
It's
see.
the convert, as it were.
Now, The Faithful Tribe was one of the only sympathetic books about the Orange Order that I know of. So what are the biggest misconceptions about the Orange Order?
Oh, that it's a secret society consumed with hatred for Catholics. And most of the people in the Orange Order that I came across, and I spent a lot of time with them, were ordinary people. This would be particularly true in the rural areas, who got out one night a week, and there was a sense of brotherhood, and very much involved with religion, very much involved with local charities. The big day a year was the parade, the 12th of July. There were an awful lot of those people who would have regarded the Catholics in their neighbourhood as their friends. In the days before the trouble started, on the 12th of July, the Catholics would look after the Protestant farmers' cattle for the day, in order to allow them to go and parade.
When did you first meet an Orangeman?
I met a couple of people who were Orangemen when I used to go to conferences. A few of the politicians were, but I got really involved in them in about 1996 when I was a journalist by then, and I was covering a lot of riots over Orange parades, which were being fabricated and provoked deliberately by Sinn Féin in order to cause it to destabilise Northern Ireland. It was very handy for them in the peace negotiations at the time to do that.
So you think which is worse, a parade or a riot?
Nothing wrong with parades.
Me neither, yeah.
No problem with parades.
So people say the Orange Order is anti-Catholic.
Tell them to read the book.
I see.
Then you actually hear from them themselves. Some of them are, of course they are. Some of them are, particularly in the urban areas. Yes. I mean, look, the two tribes in Northern Ireland, an awful lot of them hate each other. It's as simple as that.
Now, the Orange Order, they often say we wouldn't speak to whatever residence committee because former IRA men are in it, terrorists, but yet they do allow loyalist terrorists into the Orange Order. Isn't that
very few of them? In many of the areas I knew, they would throw out anybody who had ever been involved in terrorism. Wouldn't have that.
I see.
The respectable ones, the ones who were involved in it for reasons of religion, took a very, very hard line on that. The point was with the residence groups that Sinn Féin organised all these residence groups, and they deliberately put at the head of them people who were ex-convicts, because they knew it would be one way of putting the Orange Order in the wrong, because the Orange Order would then refuse to speak to them.
Right. What should people know about the Northern Ireland Troubles that they don't know?
That you have two tribes who are culturally so separate, whose narratives of the past are so separate, that there is no possibility of them ever seeing things in the same way.
But I know you're a Dubliner, but you're Catholic, right? But you're not nationalist. So it is possible to reject a nationalist narrative, or likewise a Protestant to reject a unionist narrative.
I wasn't born in an area of tribal struggle and hatred, and I had a family. I was very fortunate in my family. They were not sectarian. But there was an enormous amount of, in areas of Dublin, you still find people, not just Dublin, but the whole of the south, you still find people who are very tribal about Northern Ireland. The time of the hunger strikers, sort of Anglophobia suddenly crops up. Blaming the Brits becomes the order of the day. It's under our surface. Now, I am not a Catholic. I was brought up Catholic, but I gave up being a Catholic in my late teens because I didn't believe it. I wasn't brought up very nationalist. It was the inclination, but I rejected that too. I'm in favour. I am concerned in Northern Ireland about the victims of terrorism and the ordinary good people who have stopped that place descending into civil war. There were an awful lot of ordinary good people, Catholic and Protestant, who would not have anything to do with murder, did not defend it, and did not vote for it. And they're the people that are my heroes.
So I remember a Sinn Féin politician, I think it was Alex Maskey, a couple of years ago, said that Northern Ireland prior to the Troubles was a putrid little sectarian statelet. Was that a fair summary?
It was a very small society with an awful lot of hatred in some areas and tension. Having said that, it had a welfare state. I'll tell you a story that I remember with great clarity, actually. I knew very little about Northern Ireland. I was sitting in my university in Dublin talking to a friend when a girl from Northern Ireland came in and sat with us and told us it was terrible being Catholic in Northern Ireland because you were discriminated against. She talked about that, and then we discovered that she was from Belfast, that she had the state had paid for her secondary school education, which did not happen in the South. Children left school at 14, it might even have been 12 in the 50s, because there was no free secondary education. We discovered that her fees were being paid in university in Dublin by the British government. There was no free university education in the South. There was no national health service. And my friend and myself were completely bewildered because we had just discovered that these terribly discrimination against Catholics had advantages beyond our wildest dreams.
I think I'm right in saying that the government of Northern Ireland paid for people to go to Maynooth, as in a Catholic seminary.
They paid for them to go to University College Dublin, paid for them to go to Trinity College. Oh yeah, but also some, yeah, it was. Yeah.
So, anyway, which individuals deserve most credit for ending the Troubles?
I don't see it as that way, really. I don't, you see, I happen to think that it was wrong to do that deal with the IRA. I think that Sinn Féin were rescued from the gutter. The IRA were losing. There was no question about it. They'd come to realise they couldn't win this way. They were getting tired, they were getting war-weary. The ordinary person who supported them was getting war-weary. And at a certain stage they were picked up by John Hume. And and by Bill Clinton and by others, and given a legitimacy they should not have been given, in my view. So therefore I think the premise of the peace process was wrong, but once it was there, it was a matter of doing a deal. I think David Trimble is one of the great heroes of it, who was the unionist leader, who was turned on by his own side, rejected, what he was doing was rejected by Ian Paisley, who later became seen as a hero of all this. I think he did a remarkable thing in coming to a deal over it. I think the second person on the national side, Seamus Mallon, who was not sectarian, was a very fine man in his way, and I think he deserves a lot of credit. I think that Tony Blair appeased paramilitaries of both kinds. I think it was shocking. I think the Irish government was given to it. I would say George Mitchell, in many ways, the American senator who chaired the talks, was a great hero of it. I don't know how anybody could have had the patience he had.
I was going to ask about John Hume, who died just last month. What's your take on him?
I think he went in the wrong direction. He didn't like unionists. Really didn't like unionists. It was not true of his deputy, Seamus Mallon. He had no friends who were Protestant unionists. He wanted to make cause with other nationalists, even if they were the IRA. Now, John Hume was a giant of courage when it came to facing down violence. He hated violence. He always stood against it. But in the end, he wanted to do a deal with Sinn Féin with the Irish government rather than doing a deal with his Protestant neighbours. That was his priority.
What view do you take of Ian Paisley?
I think without Ian Paisley there was a chance the Troubles wouldn't have happened. I think he was a dreadful, dreadful influence in Northern Ireland. He was a rabble-rouser, he encouraged hatred, and in the end he set out to destroy every organisation he was involved with if he wasn't on top of it. In the end he made peace because now he was the leader of unionism, having destroyed David Trimble's party, and he could be First Minister, and he could have that on his headstone. And he, from the point of view of his church, he betrayed them. From the point of view of his party, he betrayed everything they'd ever stood for. And then he did a lap of honour as a man of peace. And I think the whole thing was disgusting.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about Irish affairs?
I'd like to say that not something I said earlier, not sufficient credit is given to the ordinary people of Northern Ireland who did not succumb to all the temptation to get involved in a civil war. I think they're wonderful people. I've come to love people in Northern Ireland, not all of them by any means, but large numbers of them, great people, and that's on both sides.
One of the other things that you're outspoken about is Israel. But isn't Israel oppressing the Palestinians?
I think if you're a tiny little state in the middle of utter hostility from all sides, they are defensive. That is what they are. Do you remember they pulled out of Gaza?
I do,
what
yes.
Happened? What happened?
There was more attacks.
Exactly. You know, they don't want this. They want to be allowed to live in peace, which in a way is very similar to what was happening with the Protestants in Northern Ireland, who want to be left in peace.
But what about it? But okay, Palestine's even smaller than Israel is, and so much of the West Bank is occupied by Israel, which has just declared that it rightfully belongs to them. What should the Palestinians do?
I think the Palestinians should be prepared actually to try to make peace in the way that some other Arab countries are now prepared to do.
Mm-hmm.
What you've had, and I am terribly sorry for the Palestinians, they've had the rawest of deals, and to a great extent they've had it from other Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
We've not taken them in, we've not given them the chance to have a decent life, we've encouraged them to live festering in hatred in refugee camps. They've had a terrible time. But it's not up to Israel to solve that. Israel doesn't want them to live like that. I would remind you that when they left Gaza, they left the means for the Gaza natives to have a decent industry. They left all the greenhouses. They left an industry, a flourishing industry. And Hamas came in and broke up every single greenhouse and destroyed the entire industry.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But you know, Gaza.
They are persecuted by their own people.
They've often had bad leadership. It's true.
Yeah.
But you know, in Gaza, the airspace and the land border, the maritime border, is all controlled by the Israelis.
And the Egyptians.
Well, I think there's one crossing border point into to
But
Egypt.
it's entirely defensive. That's the problem. I don't think Israel is perfect by any means. Of course it's not. I'm a critical friend of Israel, but I think it is desperate just to be left in peace. And the fact of the matter is that most of its enemies wanted it completely wiped off the map.
Well, that's true,
And
but
still want that.
But Palestine's been largely wiped off the map already. Surely they, you know, people say, the Zionists always say, a country has the right to defend itself, but doesn't that apply to Palestine too?
It's not a country, actually.
It's a what then?
They had every chance. I mean, it was their own leaders who wrecked the two-state solution, which the Israelis had signed up to. It was them that decided that an intifada was what was required.
I mean,
They sell their own people down there all the time.
Netanyahu supposedly tried to wreck it as well. And there's been seemingly no outcry about Israel claiming that the West Bank lawfully belongs to them.
There's plenty of outcry all the time about Israel, and very little. I'm always fascinated by all these great left-wing movements who are so upset about Israel and don't care about the torture and murder and eradication of a whole culture that's going on. China is doing it.
Well,
The
to the
Uyghurs.
Uyghurs and so on, yes.
Uyghurs, I mean, that is the most atrocious happening on this planet, and I don't know why anybody thinks that what's happening with the Palestinians is on a par with that. They have set out to eradicate a culture, eradicate a religion, and they are actually murdering people who in any way resist them. That's a little bit more important.
Right. So who's the worst tyrant in the world at the moment?
I really am not in a position to judge on that. I'm sure there's all sorts of people being absolutely dreadful that I haven't even heard of.
I see.
But I think President Xi is doing quite a good job of going for the title.
Yes, indeed. But
in a nice suit and with a big smile.
sort of, well, too economically powerful to be resisted, so it seems to me.
So we've got to resist him as much as we can. He's tried to buy the world. What he's doing in Africa, he's bought large chunks of Africa. He's buying large chunks of Europe. He's buying South America. I think possibly hubris will do for him. I'm hoping. And I hope it won't be too much bloodshed.
I'm glad you broached Africa. Cecil Rhodes' statue is going to be removed by Oxford University next year. Is that the right decision?
No, it's not the right decision. You cannot eradicate history. What you have to do is discuss it. There is an excellent man who is the mayor of Bristol at the moment, who has experienced a statue being toppled and thrown into the port of somebody who was once a slave trader, but was also a great philanthropist. And the mayor, who is black, fished out that statue from the river, parked it in a museum, said, I will consult locally on what they want to happen to this. And when an artist put up in a spirit of virtue signalling a statue of a black activist woman, he had that removed and sent a bill to the artist for the cost of removing the statue. And he said, our community will decide what we want. That is the spirit. And what the spirit of it all is, and what they should have been doing for years, is, beside contentious statues or pictures, to put an explanatory text and get people discussing it. So this man was a great philanthropist who did wonderful things for people of Bristol, but he made his money on slavery. Discuss.
So that
Same thing with Rhodes. Rhodes didn't make it out of slavery, but he was an imperialist. Rhodes, I mean, the very people who've been leading the protests against Rhodes in Oxford are on Rhodes scholarships.
But that doesn't oblige them to approve of what he did.
No, but they might take it into account.
They could. I mean, I know some of them say, Zimbabwean and Zambian students said, yes, we're just getting back a fraction of the wealth that was plundered from our ancestors.
Any of
Is
the
that
ones
fair?
I've ever talked to are pig ignorant and don't know any history. I mean, pay attention to them if they know any history.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the stuff of the statues is totally ignorant. One of the statues that's been torn down in America was of Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave who was one of the great inspirations of the abolition of slavery movement.
I'm astonished anyone would tear his statue down.
It's ignorance.
I mean,
Pig ignorance.
but coming back to that, Edmund Colliston was the guy in Bristol, I think.
Colston,
Yeah.
yeah.
The statue is not in the original place. He said it's in a museum.
Well, for the moment, because
Yeah.
it's parked at the moment, because he's going to consult the community.
It's possible it could be reinstated in its original location.
Anything is possible if that's what the locals wanted.
Right.
Nobody's any right to tear down statues.
Yeah. One thing I point out is, like, in Ireland we've done this. We removed William of Orange from College Green in Dublin, or we removed Queen Victoria from outside Leinster House. That didn't improve our relations with Great Britain.
No, not the British didn't really care. It was a pointless gesture, but you now have very interesting things happening in Ireland, in the island of Ireland. I offer you John Mitchell, who was a great hero of Irish nationalism, who, when he eventually went to America, became a great defender of slavery, and 2 of his sons perished on the Confederate side in the Civil War.
He absolutely detested the Native Americans as well.
Yeah, so that's John Mitchell, and his statue is there in Newry. What do you do about him? I think you put up an explanatory leaflet myself, explanatory plaque. What do you do about Sean Russell, who was head of the IRA, to whom there is a statue in Dublin? He died on a U-boat in 1944 on his way back from training in explosives in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with him? I think you put up an explanatory plaque.
Right.
Because once you start tearing them down, there's something to be said against everybody. You can certainly be sure most of them were sexist.
Should the United Kingdom apologise for imperialism?
Certainly not. Ridiculous. Every other country, should Spain, should France, should Germany, should the Ottoman Empire, what were they going to do about it?
Okay, some people say yes.
Of course, they're not thinking. There's no rational reason for this. You apologise for what you did yourself. I have made apologies in my life, not on behalf of anybody else. The things I've done, and I hope you've done the same, George. And you cannot make Tony Blair once apologised for the famine. For God's sake, the famine was in the 1840s. What's it got to do with Tony Blair?
Mm-hmm.
It's just virtue signalling.
I thought there was no need for it. Some people said it helped the peace process. Okay, almost nobody remembers Blair also apologized for slavery twice, but it has done nothing really. That's why I'm a bit skeptical about apologizing for imperialism. Even if it's something to be apologized for, would it achieve anything?
No. I think what we should be doing is tackling the slavery that is all over the world at the moment. We're not doing enough about it.
It's not an either or. We could do both. Apologize for
We can't
evil.
apologise. We didn't do it.
Okay, but this is not living individuals, but collectively. Is national pride, is that ever a good thing?
I think the Germans showed what should have been done, and they did do it after the war because they were alive. They had been alive through the whole Nazi period. A lot of them had voted for the Nazis, a lot of them had fought for the Nazis. They apologised and they admitted what they'd done, they faced what they had done, and I think they have a lot to be proud of for the way they dealt with that. But you don't apologise for what your great-grandfather did.
Yeah, well, the thing about Germany was obviously almost immediately afterwards, and even Kiesinger, one of their chancellors in the mid-60s, he'd actually been in the Nazi party in the 40s, so it was the same individuals in some cases.
And by contrast, the Austrians never even didn't admit that they were pro-Nazi.
Well, a bit of a myth was created that Austria was the first victim of the Third Reich.
They were cheering him on.
Well, it was a majority of Austrians wanted to join Germany, even if they weren't actually Nazis.
Yeah. But they're only just beginning to face up to what they did. And the French have not faced up to what they did. Collaboration. They haven't.
I want to ask you about something completely different. Now, Sean O'Callaghan was a Kerryman who was in the IRA, came to think he was on the wrong side, became an informer for the Garda Síochána, that's the police in the Republic of Ireland, and did so much to combat the IRA. You knew him very well. How did you come to know Sean O'Callaghan?
I went to see him in jail because he had started to write articles explaining what was going on in the thinking of Republicans. And they were very impressive articles. So a friend who had met him took me to see him in jail, and I found him an extraordinary source of understanding of the whole thing. I mean, I was struggling to understand what was going on in the Republican world. So I used to visit him quite frequently, and then when he came out of jail, he came to London where I live, and we became very good friends and allies in all sorts of ways, and anti-IRA stuff and anti-terrorist stuff. He became actually very close to David Trimble, became advisor to him on republicanism.
A lot of Sinn Féiners say that O'Callaghan exaggerated his position, that he wasn't the head of Southern Command of the IRA. Do you think anything he said was a lie?
No, I mean, I remember when he was writing the book, he was utterly and absolutely punctilious about ensuring that there wasn't one thing in that book that wasn't true, because he said he wanted to convince some of his ex-colleagues that when they read it and saw that the parts that touched on them were true, they would realise that the rest of it was probably true, that might open a lot of eyes. So there were no lies in that. And you know how many of the people who say he was a Walter Mitty, that's what they always say, they ignore the fact that Garret FitzGerald, who was once the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, the Taoiseach, he wrote afterwards when Sean came out of jail and began to write stuff about it. He said, we owe an enormous amount to the courage and, what was the other word, selflessness of Sean O'Callaghan.
I see.
Because he had been the Taoiseach, he'd been getting the private reports, and he knew some of the things that he had done.
Right.
So that's what the IRA do. They rubbish your reputation. I mean, they do it to me because I'm a critic of theirs. They write lies about me all the time.
What do they say about you?
Well, at the moment, apparently, I live bitter and alone with a lot of cats in Surrey. Don't ask me why. I don't even have I've never done in much for cats. And I'm not lonely. All sorts of things. I work for MI5, I work for MI6, I do it all. I'm rich, I'm really rich because of all the money I get from MI5 and MI6, and from newspaper barons, because obviously I don't mean what I write, I'm paid to do it, all that sort of stuff. It's just what they do. I mean, Twitter is full of them, just endless lies. I won't mention the words they use about me because you'd have to be sensitive, I suspect, on that. Yeah, I mean, that's what they do. And with Sean, they just started from the beginning saying it was all lies, all lies. things. And then gradually, you see, it would turn out that this was true and this was true and the other was given. But you see, you can't trust them at all, and that they're barefaced, shameless liars, Sinn Féin.
So maybe the central foundation of Sinn Féin is to believe that Irish people and British people are really just poles apart. Are Irish people British in any sense?
We're all a mixture. We're, it'd be very hard to find an Irish person who is just Irish. There's a lot of English blood, there's a lot of Welsh blood, there's a lot of Scottish blood, and there's many other things. I remember the first time I was told I wasn't Irish, I was a bit taken aback. It was by an Irish American. I'd given a talk on Patrick Pearson somewhere in America. And she came from NORAID, which was the outfit which raised money for the IRA to arm the IRA, really. Anyway, she stood up afterwards and she said to me, "You haven't got one drop of Irish blood in your veins."
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was born and brought up in Ireland. I'm 3/4 pure Irish. She'd never even been to Ireland.
The thing is, even if what she said was true, that wouldn't diminish the accuracy of your book at all.
No, it's just the wild that you see. You're finding it at the moment very interestingly in the woke revolt, because there was a stage that if you had any black blood of any kind, you were black, right? That was the okay position on it. So Obama was black. He was never mixed race, but he was absolutely mixed race. He was half and half. The thing was that he had to be black, and everybody was called black, including light-skinned Indians. That's right. Now, all of a sudden, a lot of blacks have been told they're not black anymore because their views are unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not Irish because I don't accept Irish nationalist views. The Asians in the British cabinet are no longer black. They're not even people of colour anymore because they're conservatives, and you can't be.
Yeah, I can't remember what this is called. This ridiculous thing where people pretend that words don't mean what they actually mean. This sort of semantic warfare.
Yeah.
So, what's your message to woke people today?
Go and do something useful with your life,
Mm-hmm.
and stop fomenting hatred. What's going on at the moment? I mean, the harm that's been done to racial harmony in the last few months is absolutely terrible. All those Antifa people the anarchists, they are destroying race relations, and they're doing it here. They foster grievances, they foster resentments. The people who will probably save us here are a very good collection of people from immigrants, a lot of them, some of them born here, who are from minority backgrounds and are saying enough of this rubbish. We want no part of this. We want to be part of a united society. They're the heroes, whatever colour they are.
What do you make of Meghan Markle?
Oh dear God. I find all that very sad because everybody here was thrilled to bits with her. Initially, they thought it was great that she was marrying somebody who was from a different kind of background. I always had doubts about her because I had doubts about Hollywood celebrities, and she has proved to be the worst kind, really. And poor boy, she's taken him away from all his friends, she's taken him away from what he knows, she's taken him away from his family, and he's utterly and absolutely deluded.
Mm-hmm.
And she puts everything down to racism. I mean, she's become a joke, actually. She's become. But it's a real shame, because the royal family welcomed her, really welcomed her, and they did everything they could, and she just was deeply resentful that he wasn't the heir to the throne.
Yeah, I know one of the complaints is, but Prince William and Kate Middleton, they get a higher billing. Well, duh. This is not an equal opportunities thing. It's primogeniture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, that's been such a marvelous long interview. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's been very interesting, George. Thank you.
Well, it's been delightful. Ruth Dudley Edwards, historian extraordinaire, one of the first people valiant enough to challenge the Irish nationalist narrative. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.